Hello, welcome back to Bethel Evangelical Free Church Hanley on YouTube. I'm Pastor Gervais Charmley. I'm here at the Manse to talk about another classic Christian book. This is a work of biography of Christian history, and it's Arnold Dallimore's two-volume biography, Life and Times of George Whitefield. My set is, Volume 1 is second hand, Volume 1 was bought new, and the result is that Volume 1 doesn't have a dust jacket. Now, of this book, Martin Lloyd-Jones said, "Justice has at last been done to the greatest preacher that England has ever produced." It is, by any standard, a classic. I first came across this work when I was at university, at what's now Chester University, what was then Chester College, and it was 20 years ago. It's an amazing book. It's an account of a life that was given over to Christian service. Whitefield is in many ways the first modern evangelist. He was born in 1714, he died in 1770. He came from Gloucester. He came from a family background that was middle class, really. His father and mother owned an inn, the Bell Inn, Gloucester, now sadly demolished. His father died when he was quite young, and so the fortunes of the family declined. Initially it seemed that he wouldn't be able to go to university, and then his mother came across a way for him to go as what was called a servitor. Now, a servitor meant that he went to university, he studied, but he studied and he basically made the money for his tuition by being a servant to other better off students. And this could be extremely difficult if you found yourself with some upper class tyrant who decided that the best thing to do, because he was important and you weren't, was to treat you not as a servant, but as a slave, as somebody whom he could humiliate and do what he liked to. Now, thankfully, Whitefield, on the whole, didn't suffer from that, but it did mean that he had a definitely lower social status. And it's very important in the character of Whitefield to consider that fact, that he had a lower social status than men like the Wesley brothers or Benjamin Ingham, these other Oxford Methodists. Now, Arnold Dallimore was a Canadian Baptist. He was born in 1911, he died in 1998. He's noted for having written not only these books, but also he wrote a biography of Edward Irving, a biography of Susanna Wesley, the mother, that is, of John and Charles, and a well-known biography of Charles Haddon Spurgeon. Dallimore was a pastor for almost 24 years at the same church in Ontario. He was a very careful scholar. He's obviously very much an enthusiast for Whitefield. But on the whole, when you're reading a biography, one of the things you want is the author of the biography to be somebody who is excited by and interested in his subject. One of the worst biographies I ever read was a book called Wrestling Jacob. It's a biography of John Wesley. It's written by a woman who clearly had absolutely no sympathy at all with either Christianity or John Wesley. Well, you put those two things together, a biography. I mean, about the only entertaining thing about certainly the first edition is the huge number of misprints in it, that it's peppered with typographical errors, some of which are quite amusing. But if you're reading a book and you're reduced to the point of this has got some funny typos in it, it's obviously a bad book. George Whitefield, though, Dallimore's Whitefield. Dallimore is enthusiastic about Whitefield. When he kind of discovered Whitefield was underappreciated. George Whitefield has generally been eclipsed by the Wesley brothers, and particularly by John Wesley. And yet the reality is that without Whitefield, no John Wesley. Because yes, John Wesley is his superior, his senior, he is older than him. John Wesley is much more influential in many ways. John Wesley, of course, was the leader, if you will, of the Oxford Methodists, whereas Whitefield joined the Oxford Methodists. But in terms of evangelicalism and evangelism and the work of the gospel, Whitefield comes first. Whitefield is converted first. Whitefield begins open-air preaching first. In fact, it's Whitefield who gets John Wesley started in open-air preaching, and Wesley is much more influential in that for a number of reasons, one of which is that Wesley's, basically his entire ministry is within the United Kingdom, which of course at the time included Ireland and Southern Ireland. So Wesley ministers, he preaches primarily in England. He's very influential in certain parts of Ireland, but in terms of Scotland and Wales, he's much less influential, because Scotland and Wales are nations where there is a prevailing Calvinism. Now, George Whitefield is Calvinistic, and so Whitefield is able to get on very well with the Welsh Methodists, Howell Harris, Daniel Rowland, particularly Howell Harris, and of course with the Scots, the Erskine brothers, for example, and evangelicals within the Church of Scotland, because these are Calvinistic and Whitefield's Calvinistic. He's able to get on much better with them. And also Whitefield has this transatlantic ministry. He crosses the Atlantic many times. 7 times he goes to America, to what of course in those days were the American colonies, because he dies before the Revolution, before the War of Independence. And he dies in America, he's buried there. Collectors have taken away most of his remains, sadly, but there's a few bones under a pulpit in a Presbyterian church in New England. His ministry has these 2 points. He's got his London base, his tabernacles in London, and he's got the orphanage in Georgia. And the orphanage becomes this central driving force for his ministry, simply because orphanages need money. And money means he's got to make collections. And collections in those days, if you were collecting, you would preach charity sermons, and that's what he does. But he's also this great evangelist. And this book, it's a big book, there is an abridgment. It's a big book about a big man who had a big impact. Now, when I first read these 20 years ago, Whitefield was widely admired among evangelicals. He is, of course, the logo of the Banner of Truth Trust. When the Banner of Truth came up with their logo, it's George Whitefield preaching. Now, Whitefield has become controversial today, because Whitefield not only owned slaves, but he advocated the introduction of slavery into the colony of Georgia. When Whitefield first arrived in Georgia, the rules of the colony, the charter of the colony, said that slavery was forbidden. And Whitefield is actually involved in lobbying Parliament to get that changed to allow slavery in Georgia. So, of course, he's immensely controversial today. You've got some people today who say, well, I don't think that Whitefield was a Christian because he did this. Well, that's no way to deal with the past. The reality is that Whitefield's attitude to slavery tells us that it's possible for somebody to be out and out for Christ, to be a fiery evangelical preacher, and yet to completely fail to see a massive problem with the society in which he lived. One of the issues there is that Whitefield has this deference to authority, this deference to his social superiors that John Wesley didn't have. Now, very largely it's because John Wesley comes from a background where he was one of the social superiors. If you go to Epworth today, even today, you see, is this isolated little place in the fens. It doesn't have a grand manor house. It doesn't have a great mansion. So that the most educated man in the entire town was the minister. So that John Wesley comes from a background where his family, okay, they may not have very much money, but his family, this is one of the big families. He is the social superior. And if you are the social superior, then it's much easier to think in terms of changing the status quo than if you're the social inferior. George Whitefield served pints of beer in his mother's inn. Now, if you're serving pints of beer to paying customers, the paying customer, and you see this today, the way that some people treat waiting staff, is abominable. They treat them as slaves. And of course Whitefield's got this whole business when he's a servitor in Oxford. So Whitefield's got this thing that he is a social inferior mixing with social superiors. And so he looks at their attitudes and he adopts them. And that means that this whole issue of slavery becomes for him one of the great unexamined issues. Wesley, of course, does examine it and comes out definitely against slavery. He calls slavery as existed in the American colonies the worst kind of slavery in human history. One of his last letters is a letter to William Wilberforce, encouraging Wilberforce in his campaign to abolish slavery. But for George Whitefield, the fact that he lives in a culture where slavery is basically accepted, and that he is a social inferior in his own mind, in his own experience, means he's much too ready to accept, oh well, slavery is just part of the society I live in. And so when people say, well look, Georgia to be developed because of its location, because of its climate, it's very difficult for white men to work the soil here, to make the soil productive. Well, these Africans, they come from Africa, and a West African climate is very similar to that in Georgia. And rather than going, yes, but West African agricultural practices are different. And if you actually look at the way the West Africans manage the land, the West African farmers work, it involves taking account of the climate. It's not that they can work through this. It's that they know how not to work through it. How to work at times of the day when the climate is better. But you have this argument, well, Africans, West Africans are better able to bear the climate. And so we bring them in to do the work. Well, that's, we looked at it today and we say, well, that's appalling. People buying and selling other people is horrible. But Whitefield lives in a society where he's got people saying, which, the slave has a better life than he'd have back in West Africa. What all the slaves who died on the passage? And how can being somebody's slave... We look at it today and it boggles the mind that people accepted these arguments, but they did. And what does that lead us to say? It leads us to say to ourselves, but are there things that I'm just accepting as the way things are that I shouldn't? So we don't write off Whitefield. We can't do that. We say he had this massive blind spot when it came to slavery. We don't write him off. Whitefield is, say he goes up to Oxford in 1732 as a servitor. He is converted. He's ordained on June the 27th, 1756. He never holds a living in the Church of England. He's an Anglican clergyman, but he never holds a living. Instead, he dedicates himself to this orphan house in Georgia and also to field preaching, to open-air preaching. And he becomes a Calvinist. He's deeply influenced by Matthew Henry. He's a friend of Isaac Watts and Philip Doddridge. He has this massive, massive blind spot with slavery. But he himself, although he owned slaves, he was never a cruel master, but he was a master. And at that point we say we must remember that the best of men are men at best. Because otherwise what we do is we do what some people do. They set men up and they say, well, here is a man who I thought was really great, and I discovered he had this massive flaw, and that means that I have to treat him as a non-entity. I mean, you've got people trying to do that at the moment with Winston Churchill, that this great war leader, and that's when he was great, that's when he was great, but this great war leader now, I have to take down the statue because of his views on the British Empire and his views on India. Oh no, we just have to go, yeah, but he was a great war leader, and he was a lousy politician sometimes. Well, George Whitefield was a great preacher who had a massive, massive blind spot when it came to just accepting something that his fellows did. Well, I'm going to read a few extracts from this wonderful biography now. And it really is, it's a book that extracts can't do it justice. You read through, it's a narrative about a man who loved God, who loved Christ and wanted to make Christ known. He was born, as we say, in 1714. His parents owned the Bell Inn in Gloucester. And when he went up to Oxford, he joined the Holy Club. He writes of himself, and there's a number of quotes from him. He says, "I was born in Gloucester in the month of December 1714. My father and mother kept the Bell Inn. The former died when I was 2 years old. The latter is now alive and has often told me how she endured 14 weeks' sickness after she brought me into the world, but was used to say, even when I was an infant, that she expected more comfort from me than from any other of her children. This, with the circumstance of my being born in an inn, has often been of service to me in exciting my endeavours to make good my mother's expectations." He went up to Oxford. He joined a group of earnest young men who were nicknamed the Holy Club, and Dallimore points out what the Holy Club was and what it wasn't. Because, however, of certain misconceptions which have grown up around the Holy Club, we must look more carefully at it. We notice, firstly, it was not famous. For its first 3 or 4 years, news of its existence spread but little beyond the university. In 1733, however, a letter which harshly attacked the Holy Club's practices appeared in Fogg's Weekly Journal, and was answered by the publication of an anonymous 30-page pamphlet entitled The Oxford Methodists. The pamphlet had but one edition at the time. Secondly, it was not evangelical. Its members knew nothing of the inward miracle of the new birth, and in their search for spiritual satisfaction turned increasingly to outward ritual. John Clayton was the chief advocate of this trend, and under his influence the Wesleys and others went so far in the Anglo-Catholic direction that they began to regard the opinions of the Fathers as all but equal in authority to the statements of Scripture. They considered setting themselves up as auricular confessors, and adopted a view of the Holy Eucharist which is very near to transubstantiation. The Oxford Methodists are walking the same path as that taken a century later by Keble and Pusey, and it might even have become that on which Newman and Faber were to find themselves. Thirdly, it was not the beginning of the revival. The Holy Club men were not only without the gospel which they were later to preach to the multitudes, but were also without the least anticipation of such preaching or such multitudes. Some quiet English parish where they might enforce their discipline on self and hearer, or some missionary enterprise where privation would further mortify their natures. These were the prospects they entertained. The Methodism of Oxford was destined to die away with the dispersion of its members. The Methodism of the Revival was to be born in 1737 and 1739 under Whitefield's flaming ministry, and thereafter to be assisted by the ministry of the Wesleys. The Methodism of the Holy Club could never have created the Methodism of the Revival. The two were vastly different, and the distinction between them must be clearly understood. Fourthly, it did not bring its members the satisfaction that they sought. The failure arose primarily from the lack of a thorough doctrinal foundation. Strange as it may seem today, such subjects as systematic theology and biblical exegesis were not taught to undergraduates at Oxford, and the Wesleys and their friends failed to make up for the lack in their private study. They read widely, but their choice ran largely to books on devotion, mysticism, self-discipline and good works, and they appear to have given little attention to the storehouses of biblical scholarship and doctrinal teaching, the works of the Reformers and Puritans. In fine, the Holy Club men knew little or nothing of grace as taught in the Scriptures. It took the conversion of George Whitefield for the Holy Club men to become evangelical. Not all of them did, of course. Whitefield writes of his conversion, "Glory, glory, glory be ascribed to an almighty triune God. Last Sunday in the afternoon I preached my first sermon in the Church of St. Mary de Crypt, where I was baptized, and also first received the sacrament of the Lord's Supper. Curiosity, as you may easily guess, drew a large congregation. The sight at first a little awed me, but I was comforted with a heartfelt sense of the divine presence, and soon found the unspeakable advantage of having been accustomed to public speaking when a boy at school, and of exhorting and teaching the prisoners and poor people at their private houses while at the university. By these means I was kept from being daunted overmuch. As I proceeded I perceived the fire kindle, till at last, though so young and amidst a crowd of those who knew me in my infant childish days, I trust I was enabled to speak with some degree of gospel authority. Some few mocked, but most of the present seemed struck, and I have since heard that a complaint has been made to the bishop that I drove 15 mad in the first sermon. The worthy prelate, as I am informed, wished that the madness might not be forgotten before next Sunday. So it began. His ministry bore fantastic fruit. That was the beginning of a ministry that spread over 2 continents, practically. England, America. A ministry that was the first great transatlantic ministry. Again, as I said, we're not to think of him or any of these great men of Christian history as perfect men, because they weren't. There's no such thing as a perfect man in that sense. The best of men are but men at best, but we must truly consider the past, because otherwise we become rootless and ultimately fruitless, adrift. But by reading about the great men of the past, not ignoring their faults, but recognizing in their faults a mirror that we can see our own faults in, then we learn, then we grow, and then we can develop. And this book, Arnold Dallimore on George Whitefield, 2 volumes, Banner of Truth, this is one of those great classics, and it's one of the 2-volume biographies that's worth being a 2-volume biography. That no page really is wasted here. Now the Banner also have produced Whitefield's journals. This is the first edition of the Banner, the Banner printing, the Banner version, and this is Whitefield in his own words. And again, very well worth reading. Crossway have published an edition of the Sermons of George Whitefield, edited by Lee Gattis. Again, very much worth reading, even though you don't really get the full effect, because as Whitefield said to a publisher, you can't put the thunder and lightning in print. Well, there we are, George Whitefield. A man deeply influential, a man, yes, he has his controversial aspects today, but I commend him to you. Read these good books, and never set up any man but the man Christ Jesus as your sinless and perfect guide. May God help us so to learn from history, from the mistakes as well as the excellencies of others, and most of all to learn to follow Christ, even as Christ calls us. Thank you for watching, and may God bless you and keep you.